In 2003, a user posted a link to a small personal website. They recommended it briefly, a few lines, nothing specific, and then they were gone. The account never posted again. The thread eventually sank. The forum moved on. Nobody paid much attention to the link. 22 years later, someone found it. This is where things stop making sense. They clicked the link, not out of expectation. A link from 2003 has no reason to work in 2025. Domain registrations expire after a year or two. Hosting lapses. Servers get decommissioned. The average lifespan of a link on the early internet was measured in months, not decades. So when the page loaded, when an actual website appeared instead of a browser error, the first assumption was a parking page, placeholder content, a domain squatter who had picked up the expired address and filled it with ads. That's not what it was. The page that loaded looked like it belonged to 2003. White background, blue hyperlinks, small animated GIF icons along the side, a visitor counter ticking slowly, the kind that used to sit at the bottom of every personal page before analytics replaced them. No advertisements, no modern code, nothing that suggested anyone had touched it in 20 years. It looked like the original website, still online, after 2 decades. And the more people looked at it, the less sense it made. Before getting into what the website contained, it's worth understanding why it being there at all was already a problem. Domain names work on a renewal cycle. You register a name, pay an annual fee, and it stays yours. When registrations lapse, domains go into a grace period, then a redemption window, and eventually they're released back into the pool for anyone to buy. The domain attached to this URL had, according to public WHOIS records, expired. Not recently, years earlier. The registration data was inconsistent in ways that compounded the problem. The listed registrar was a company that had itself been acquired and absorbed into a larger organization in the mid-2000s. The name server entries pointed to infrastructure that no longer existed in its original form. And yet, DNS resolution worked. The domain pointed somewhere. The server responded. Investigators filed a query with the registrar's successor organization. The response came back weeks later. They had no record of the domain being actively maintained, no billing account, no renewal history after the listed expiration. So who was paying for it? Or, more precisely, was anyone paying for it? One researcher put it this way: domains don't just survive on their own. They need a registrar, a name server, a hosting account, someone paying the bill. Every one of those things has a paper trail. This one has nothing. The community decided to look at the site itself. The HTML was simple, almost aggressively so. No JavaScript frameworks, no CSS style sheets beyond basic inline styling. No cookies, no tracking pixels. The page weight was small enough to load almost instantaneously, even on a throttled connection. Someone ran a tracer out. The hops were unusual, psych. The request was routing through nodes that investigators didn't recognize as belonging to any major hosting provider. Someone else tried to identify the server software from the HTTP headers. The header returned a server string that corresponded to software that had last been actively developed in 2007. Not legacy infrastructure running old software. Software that had been discontinued for nearly 2 decades, still apparently serving a live website. That was the first layer. The second layer was what investigators found when they looked at the website's own internal structure. The Wayback Machine is not perfect. It misses content. It preserves pages incompletely. Robots.txt exclusions, rate limiting, and sheer volume mean that the Internet Archive is always a partial record rather than a complete one. That said, I just went to a personal website from 2003 that stayed online for 2 decades, should have left a reasonable trail, a few dozen snapshots, some consistency across years. What investigators found was neither of those things. Several years of the site's timeline were simply absent, not sparse, absent. No snapshots for entire calendar years in the middle of a documented period when the site appeared to be active. The snapshots that did exist didn't agree with each other. Not in the way that partial snapshots typically disagree. Missing images, broken links, scripts that didn't load. The disagreements were more fundamental than that. A snapshot from 1 year showed a navigation menu with 4 items: home, about, photos, and contact. A snapshot from the same year, archived 4 months later, showed the same navigation menu with 6 items. 2 new sections had appeared: archive, and the label that would become significant: notes. Both snapshots were dated within the same calendar year. Neither showed any indication of an update. That would have been unusual on its own. Then investigators started comparing notes across the community and found something that moved the investigation in a different direction entirely. People were reporting different versions of the same archived snapshot, not different snapshots from different dates. The same URL, the same Wayback Machine timestamp. One user reported a specific archived page contained 3 paragraphs of text. Another user, accessing the same URL minutes later, found 5. A third found a photograph embedded between the second and third paragraph that the other 2 hadn't seen. The first theory was caching. Different CDN nodes serving slightly different versions of the same archived content. This happens occasionally with large platforms under load. Investigators tested it. Multiple users accessed the snapshot simultaneously from different locations, using different browsers, fresh sessions, VPNs, routing through different countries. The results were inconsistent. Same URL, same timestamp, different content, and nobody had a clean explanation for why. While the archive inconsistency remained unresolved, a separate line of investigation had been running in parallel. Someone had been reading the source code. HTML source inspection is basic. Right-click, view source, read the markup. Most personal websites from the early 2000s have clean, readable code, minimal nesting, inline styles, straightforward link structures. This one was mostly that, except for a block of HTML comments near the bottom of the page. HTML comments are not rendered by browsers. They're notes left inside the code. Developer reminders, disabled sections, documentation for anyone who happens to look at the source. They're common. Finding them on an old personal website was not inherently significant. These comments contained links, not to external sites, to subdirectories on the same server, 2 in particular, /archive/ and /logs/. Neither of these was linked anywhere on the visible website. No navigation menu, no footer, no reference in any of the page text. They had been placed inside comments, visible only to someone who looked at the source code. Investigators tried both. /logs/returned a 403 error. Forbidden. The directory existed, but access was denied. /archive/opened. It was a file listing, no styling, just a plain directory index, the kind of server-generated file list that appears when a web server has directory listing enabled and no index file to display instead. The list was long. PDFs, JPEGs, TXT files, a handful of file formats that required specific software to open, software that predated modern operating systems. Most of the files had names that were dates, 8-digit strings, year, month, day, with no other descriptor. Investigators began downloading them. The PDFs were text documents, short mostly, a few paragraphs each. They read like field notes, observations written quickly without apparent concern for audience or presentation. The JPEGs were photographs. Nothing in the photographs was immediately identifiable. Buildings mostly, roads, empty interiors. The kind of photographs that document a place rather than commemorate it. And then someone looked at the metadata. Metadata is the information embedded inside a file that the file itself doesn't display. Creation timestamps, edit history, software versions, device identifiers, GPS coordinates, if the file came from a device that recorded them. For investigators trying to understand when files were made and where, metadata is usually the most reliable source of evidence. It's harder to alter than visible content. And when it's inconsistent with other evidence, that inconsistency is meaningful. The metadata on these files was inconsistent in ways that were difficult to explain. Several photographs had file creation dates in 1999, early 2000 at the latest. The EXIF data, the embedded camera information, reference software that hadn't been released until years after those dates. One image's embedded software string corresponded to a version released in 2006, a photograph supposedly taken in 1999, processed with software released in 2006. The PDFs were stranger. PDF metadata includes a created timestamp and a modified timestamp. Ordinarily, the created timestamp precedes the modified timestamp. You create a document, then edit it later. Several of these files had modified timestamps that predated their created timestamps. They appeared to have been edited before they existed. This kind of metadata corruption isn't impossible. Clock errors, time zone misconfigurations, software bugs can all produce anomalous timestamps. Investigators considered each of these explanations. They couldn't make any of them account for the full pattern. The errors were too consistent. Two directional sites, consistently backward, never forward. Then someone found the GPS coordinates. 3 of the JPEG files contained embedded GPS data, real coordinates, latitude and longitude. Investigators mapped them. The locations were real places. 2 were in the eastern United States. 1 was in Western Europe, which didn't fit with any obvious interpretation of what the website was or who had built it. At the coordinates in current satellite imagery, there was nothing remarkable. Undeveloped land, a road junction, a field. But current satellite imagery is current. It shows what's there now. Investigators started looking at historical records, county property documents, planning applications, old maps. At one of the U.S. coordinates, a property record from the mid-1990s referenced a structure, a building of some kind. The The document was bureaucratic enough that the description was vague, referencing only the plot dimensions and a structure classification. The record had a demolition note appended to it, sometime in the early 2000s. The photograph associated with those coordinates showed the building. Exterior shot, daylight, nothing dramatic about it. The photograph's file name was a date in 2001. The building was demolished a few years later, so that matched roughly. The photograph existed before the demolition, but the GPS coordinates embedded in the JPEG file referenced a format specification that wasn't standardized until 2007. A 2001 photograph, GPS coordinates, in a format that didn't exist until 2007, of a building that was demolished, before either of those dates would have mattered. The deeper investigators went, the less the timeline held together. The archive inconsistency had been partially set aside while investigators focused on the files. Then it returned, and this time, it wasn't just the archive. It was the live website itself. Investigators had been sharing the URL across several platforms. Communities that dealt with lost media, internet archaeology, digital mysteries. The kind of communities that approach an unusual URL methodically, document everything, cross-reference everything, assume nothing. The reports coming back were contradictory in ways that the archive anomaly hadn't prepared people for. Some visitors reported the website had 5 pages. Others found 12. One user documented an entire photo gallery and dozens of images, organized by what appeared to be year. Nobody else who subsequently visited the site could locate this gallery, not through the navigation, not through the source code. The initial explanations were reasonable. Browser caching can serve stale content. Some users might have been accessing proxies or cached copies without realizing it. Regional CDN nodes can serve slightly different versions of content during rollouts. Investigators ruled these out methodically. Users cleared caches, disabled proxies, confirmed they were resolving to the same IP address, and still returned different results. Someone started a shared document, a grid. Each row a different visitor, each column a page or section of the website. Users filled in what they could and couldn't access. The pattern that emerged was not random. It wasn't that some users saw more and some saw less. It was that what users saw overlapped imperfectly. Sets of content that intersected without any single user seeing the full picture. As if the website was different for everyone. Not broken, different. Then the screen recording started. Several investigators recorded their sessions. Screen capture software running in the background while they navigated the website. When the recordings were compared, the same page appeared to have different content depending on who was viewing it. Not rendered differently, not styled differently. Different text, different images, different links. One recording showed a page called Correspondence, 3 paragraphs of text that appeared to be excerpts from emails. The emails were undated. The recipients and senders were identified only by single initials. Nobody else found this page. Another recording showed a page called Reference, a list of links to external URLs, most of which returned 404 errors. Several investigators tried to trace where those URLs had once pointed. Most couldn't be recovered. One appeared to have once been a university library catalog. Nobody else found this page either. The content being found appeared to be real, documentable, screenshotable, present in recordings. It just wasn't consistently findable. It appeared and didn't appear in ways that didn't map onto any technical explanation investigators could confirm. 3 weeks into the active investigation, one user found a page that nobody had documented before. It wasn't accessible through the navigation menu, not through any link in the source code. They had reached it by manually entering a subdirectory path, a guess, essentially, based on the naming conventions of the hidden directories already found. The page was almost empty. No header, no navigation, no images, no links, just a single line of text centered on a white background. The archive is never complete. No author, no timestamp, no context. Investigators began documenting it immediately. Screenshots, source code, server headers, every accessible piece of information about a page that contained almost none. The server headers were the most interesting part. The last modified header, the HTTP field that tells browsers when a page was most recently changed, returned a date that was 4 days earlier, 4 days before anyone had found the page, 4 days before the investigation had found it, before it had been shared anywhere, before the community had coalesced around this website as something worth examining. The page had been updated, or at least according to its own server headers it had, before anyone in the active investigation knew it existed. People checked again the following morning. The page was gone. Not returning an error, not redirecting, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The Wayback Machine had no snapshot, no cache, no trace of it in any index. The only record was the screenshots and source captures investigators had taken in the hours between its discovery and its disappearance. Some investigators questioned whether the page had ever been what it appeared: a dynamically generated placeholder, a test page accidentally left accessible, a coincidence in the subdirectory path that had produced something that looked meaningful. These explanations were reasonable. Nobody could confirm them. And then, within the week, the main website disappeared too. The URL that had loaded reliably, that had somehow persisted for 2 decades, stopped resolving. No redirect, no error page, DNS simply returned nothing. The website was gone. That was the investigation, or as much of it as was ever resolved. The website is gone now, at least in the form investigators encountered it. The domain no longer resolves. The files from the /archive/directory exist only in the copies people downloaded during the investigation. The screenshots of the correspondence page, the reference page, the near-empty page with its single sentence. Those exist only on the drives of the people who took them. Nobody has been identified as the creator. No account, no registration record, no digital footprint that pointed unambiguously to a specific person. The forum post from 2003, the one that contained the original link, was traced to an account that had posted only twice. The second post was the website recommendation. The first, from several months earlier, was a short reply in a thread about a completely unrelated topic. The account was never active again after 2003. Investigators tried to trace the account's email address. It had been registered with a free webmail provider that had since shut down through a service that hadn't retained records past a certain point. Dead end. There are several ways to read what happened. The most straightforward: a personal website from the early 2000s, built by someone with enough technical knowledge to run their own server infrastructure, survived longer than expected through a combination of automated systems and obscure hosting arrangements. The metadata inconsistencies were the result of sloppy time configuration, servers with misconfigured clocks, software that wrote incorrect timestamps. The archive variations were a caching artifact. The different content seen by different users was confirmation bias. People in a community primed to find mysteries, reading ambiguity as significance. This explanation is defensible. It doesn't fully account for the screen recordings. It doesn't account for the last modified header predating discovery. It doesn't account for why the website disappeared within a week of being actively investigated, after apparently surviving for 2 decades without incident. The other readings don't fully account for things either. What's left is a collection of documented observations that don't cohere into a single clean explanation. A domain that shouldn't have been online, files whose dates contradict themselves, a website that appeared to be different things to different people at the same time, a single sentence on a page that appeared 4 days before anyone found it, and a 2003 forum post from an account that posted twice and never returned. Some websites disappear because they're abandoned. Nobody updates them. Nobody pays the renewal. The infrastructure ages out and eventually there's nothing left to serve. This one didn't follow that pattern. It survived for 22 years without any evidence of active maintenance. It appeared online, behaved strangely for the duration of a 3-week investigation, and then stopped resolving within days of being widely documented. Whether that's coincidence or something else, whether the archive was incomplete because of technical failure or something more deliberate, is a question the evidence doesn't answer. What the evidence does confirm is simpler than any of that. Somewhere in the oldest parts of the internet, there are still corners that don't behave the way they should, pages that load when they shouldn't, files whose timestamps point in the wrong direction, websites that seem to know they're being watched, and at least one sentence on at least one page that said exactly what the investigation eventually proved. The archive is never complete.